The lone figure of a man was barely visible through the curtain of snow that fell across the Montana territory. The wind howled mercilessly, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles against exposed skin. But Knox Sullivan hardly noticed. 6 years on his own had hardened him against the elements, just as surely as life had hardened his heart. The blizzard of 1876 had come earlier than expected, catching even the most weather-wise frontiersmen off guard. Knox had been tracking a small herd of elk when the sky darkened without warning. He'd managed to find shelter in a small cave tucked into the foothills of the Bitterroot Mountains, not his first choice, but better than freezing to death on the open plain. As he coaxed his small fire to life, Knox pulled his worn leather coat tighter around his broad shoulders. The flames cast dancing shadows across his weathered face, illuminating eyes that had seen too much for a man of 32. His dark beard was flecked with bits of ice and snow, and his calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency as he arranged his meager supplies. Knox had always been a solitary man, even before the war. After Gettysburg, after watching his entire regiment get cut down in a single afternoon, he'd retreated further into himself. The West offered exactly what he needed: space, silence, and the freedom to be left completely alone. His fire was small but sufficient. Knox was careful with his resources, never building a blaze larger than necessary. Wood was precious during these mountain winters, and he'd learned the hard way that a man could freeze to death with trees all around him if he didn't plan properly. He had enough kindling to last the night, maybe two if he was conservative. He was just settling in, his coffee pot nestled in the coals, when he heard a sound so faint it was almost lost in the howling wind. Knox went still, every sense alert. Years of tracking and hunting had taught him to distinguish between the ordinary sounds of the wilderness and those that signaled danger. Or opportunity, there it was again, not an animal. A human sound, a soft, broken cry carried on the wind. Knox's jaw tightened. He had no interest in company. Whoever was out there wasn't his concern. The mountains were unforgiving to the unprepared, and he wasn't responsible for fools who ventured into the wild without respect for its dangers. He poured his coffee, the aromatic steam rising in the cold air. Another cry reached him, this one weaker than before. Knox closed his eyes, willing himself to ignore it. But something in that sound, the raw desperation of it, stirred something he'd thought long dead. With a muttered curse, Knox set down his cup and reached for his rifle. Stepping to the mouth of the cave, he peered into the swirling snow. At first he saw nothing but white. Then a dark shape materialized perhaps 50 yards away, a figure struggling through knee-deep snow, hunched against the wind. Knox watched, still telling himself it wasn't his problem. But when the figure stumbled and fell, not rising again, he found himself moving forward, plunging into the storm before he could reconsider. The snow was brutal, each step requiring effort as he fought his way toward the fallen stranger. As he drew closer, he could make out more details smaller than he'd expected, wrapped in what appeared to be a woefully inadequate coat. When he reached the figure and knelt down, Knox was surprised to find himself looking into the face of a woman. Her skin was frightfully pale, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that sent alarm through his body. Her eyes fluttered open at his touch, striking green eyes filled with fear and exhaustion. "Can you walk?" Knox had to shout to be heard above the wind. She tried to speak, but her words were swallowed by the storm. She attempted to rise, but her limbs seemed uncooperative. Without further deliberation, Knox slid his arms beneath her and lifted her against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, and that concerned him almost as much as her color. The journey back to the cave seemed twice as long, the woman a deadweight in his arms. By the time Knox crossed the threshold of his shelter, his own strength was flagging. He placed her as close to the fire as was safe, immediately adding more wood to build up the flames. Conservation be damned, the woman was in the early stages of freezing to death. As the fire grew brighter, Knox got his first proper look at her. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with hair the color of chestnuts partially hidden beneath a snow-crusted woolen scarf. Her clothes were of decent quality but entirely unsuited for a Montana winter. She wore a city coat, the kind that might keep off a chill in St. Louis but was useless against a mountain blizzard. "Miss, can you hear me?" Knox removed his gloves and pressed his fingers to her neck, relieved to find a pulse, however faint. Her eyes opened again, more focused this time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough. "Don't thank me yet," he replied gruffly. "You're still half frozen. Can you move your fingers and toes?" She concentrated, her face contorting with pain as circulation began returning to her extremities. "Yes," she gasped. "It hurts." "That's good. Hurt means you'll keep all your parts." Knox reached for his saddlebag and pulled out a flask. "Drink this, just a sip." She accepted the whiskey, coughing as it burned down her throat. Some color began to return to her cheeks, a good sign. "My name is Faith," she said after a moment. "Faith Porter." Knox nodded once, acknowledging the introduction without offering his own name in return. "What are you doing out here alone, Miss Porter? This isn't exactly Boston Common." A shadow crossed her face. "I was traveling with a wagon train. We were headed to Oregon." She paused, swallowing hard. "There was an accident. Our wagon went off the trail during a river crossing. My father. He didn't make it. I was separated from the others." Knox said nothing, but inwardly he cursed. The Oregon Trail claimed dozens of lives each year, and wagon trains were known to continue on even after losing members. The needs of the many outweighed the grief of one lost daughter. "How long have you been wandering?" he asked. 3 days, I think. I found some abandoned mining cabins for shelter, but I ran out of food yesterday. I was trying to follow the river, hoping to find a settlement." She looked up at him, her gaze direct despite her weakened state. "I thought I was going to die out there." "You nearly did." Knox turned away from those green eyes, uncomfortable with their scrutiny. He busied himself preparing a simple meal of jerky and beans, aware of her watching his every move. "You haven't told me your name," Faith said after a period of silence. Knox hesitated. Names meant connections, and connections meant complications. "Knox," he finally replied, offering nothing more. "Just Knox." A hint of a smile touched her lips. "It's enough." He handed her a tin cup of beans. "Eat slowly. Your stomach will reject it otherwise." Faith accepted the food gratefully, taking small, deliberate bites. Knox noticed her hands trembling, whether from cold or exhaustion, he couldn't tell. He shrugged off his heavy buffalo hide coat and placed it around her shoulders. She looked up, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you," she said softly. Knox merely grunted in response, turning his attention back to the fire. The storm showed no signs of abating, its fury only seeming to increase as night fully descended. They would be trapped in this cave until it passed a day at minimum, possibly longer. "The storm's too bad to travel," he said, more to himself than to her. "We'll have to wait it out." Faith nodded, pulling his coat tighter around her slender frame. "I'm sorry to impose on your supplies." "I wasn't planning on company," Knox admitted, his tone neutral rather than accusatory. "But I've got enough to get by." As she finished her meal, Knox observed her more carefully. There was a quiet dignity in how she held herself, despite her circumstances. Most women he'd encountered would be hysterical after what she'd been through, the loss of her father, being abandoned by the wagon train, nearly freezing to death in a blizzard. Yet here she sat, composed and clear-eyed. "You should rest," he told her, arranging his bedroll near the fire. "Take this, I'll keep watch." "You need sleep too," Faith protested. "I'm used to going without." It wasn't a boast, just a statement of fact. Years of war and wilderness had trained him to function on minimal rest. Faith seemed ready to argue further, but exhaustion won out. She settled onto the bedroll, his coat still wrapped around her. Within minutes, her breathing deepened and evened out. Knox added more wood to the fire, then leaned back against the cave wall, his rifle across his knees. Outside, the storm raged, but inside their small shelter, a strange peace had settled. It had been years since Knox had shared a fire with another person. The sensation was foreign, almost uncomfortable, yet something about the woman's presence felt oddly right. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. Come morning, once the storm cleared, he would point her in the direction of the nearest settlement and continue on his way. No complications, no connections. Yet as the night wore on and Knox watched the gentle rise and fall of Faith's chest, the steady rhythm of her breathing, he couldn't ignore a troubling realization. For the first time in 6 years, he didn't feel completely alone, and that scared him far more than any blizzard. Dawn came with muted light filtering through the relentless snowfall. The storm had not abated during the night, and if anything, seemed to have intensified. Knox had dozed intermittently, always with one eye open, a habit formed from years of solitary survival in hostile territory. Faith stirred, her eyes opening slowly as she oriented herself to her surroundings. For a moment, confusion clouded her features, then recognition and memory returned. "Good morning," she said, her voice stronger than it had been the previous night. Knox nodded in acknowledgement. "Storm's still bad. We're staying put today." Faith sat up, wincing slightly as she moved. "My muscles feel as though I've been trampled by horses." "That's the cold leaving your body," Knox explained, handing her a cup of freshly brewed coffee. "The pain means you're healing." She accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her slender fingers around it for warmth. "How long do these storms usually last?" "Hard to say. Could be another day, could be 3. Knox moved to the cave entrance, studying the white wall of snow that obscured the world beyond. "We have enough supplies if we're careful." Faith sipped her coffee, watching him with those perceptive green eyes. "You don't talk much, do you, Knox?" He turned, giving her a measured look. "Never found much use for it out here." "Out here, you mean in the mountains?" "In the West," he clarified. "Words don't keep you warm or fed. Actions do." Faith considered this, then surprised him with a small smile. "My father used to say something similar. He believed in the power of deeds over declarations." Her expression faltered at the mention of her father, grief momentarily shadowing her face. Knox felt an unwelcome pang of empathy. "How did he die?" The question came out before he could stop it. Faith set down her cup, composing herself. "The river was higher than we expected, our wagon. It overturned in the crossing. Father was trapped beneath it. I tried to reach him, but the current—" She stopped, swallowing hard. "By the time I made it to shore downstream, the wagon train had moved on. They must have assumed we both perished." Knox frowned. "They didn't search for survivors. There was another family right behind us. They saw the wagon go under. I suppose they reported what they saw, and the train leader made the decision to continue." There was no bitterness in her voice, only a resigned acceptance. "Winter is coming." They couldn't risk the entire train for one person who might or might not have survived. "Hard country makes for hard decisions," Knox agreed, though privately he thought the wagon master had been too quick to abandon the search. "Where were you headed? Oregon, you said?" Faith nodded. "My father had a brother in Willamette Valley. He has a farm there, promised father land to start our own homestead." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know what I'll do now." "First thing is to get you to civilization," Knox said practically. "There's a settlement about 3 days' ride from here, Piney Creek. Not much to look at, but they've got a general store, a telegraph office. You could send word to your uncle from there." "And then what?" Faith asked quietly. Knox shrugged. "That's for you to decide." They fell into silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. Knox busied himself with checking his supplies, mentally calculating how long they could stretch their provisions if the storm persisted. "May I ask you something, Knox?" Faith's voice broke the silence. He glanced up, wary. "Depends on what it is." "What brought you out here alone in the wilderness?" Her question was direct, her gaze unwavering. Knox stiffened. No one had asked him that question in years, mainly because he rarely encountered anyone who cared to know. His first instinct was to deflect or ignore the query entirely, but something in Faith's expression, a genuine interest without judgment, loosened his tongue. "The war," he said simply. "After Gettysburg, I'd seen enough of humanity to last several lifetimes." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You fought for the Union?" Knox nodded once. "Pennsylvania, 83rd Infantry. My father's brother, my uncle in Oregon, he fought as well. He came home. Different." Faith spoke carefully, as if treading on fragile ground. "He said the mountains helped, the space, the solitude." "Your uncle's a wise man," Knox acknowledged. He didn't elaborate further, but he didn't need to. Faith seemed to understand what remained unsaid. The day passed slowly, marked by simple activities tending the fire, preparing meals, taking inventory of supplies. Despite his initial reservations, Knox found Faith's presence less intrusive than he'd expected. She didn't fill the air with needless chatter, respecting the comfortable silence that often fell between them. When she did speak, her questions were thoughtful, her observations astute. By late afternoon, Knox had learned that Faith was 26, had been born and raised in St. Louis, and had trained as a school teacher before her father decided to seek their fortune in Oregon. She was well-read and quick-witted, traits Knox grudgingly admired. "What will you do once you've escorted me to Piney Creek?" Faith asked as they shared a simple dinner of salt pork and hardtack. Knox hadn't given it much thought. "Continue north, most likely. I was tracking a herd of elk before the storm hit." "You're a hunter then?" "Among other things. I trap, guide occasionally when I need supplies I can't make or hunt myself." Knox used a stick to stir the fire. "I stay busy enough." Faith studied him across the flames. "Sounds lonely." The observation caught him off guard. Knox had never thought of his existence as lonely, solitary, yes, but that had been by choice, not circumstance. He'd convinced himself that he preferred it this way. "I'm used to it," he finally replied. "Being used to something doesn't mean it's what you want," Faith said softly, "or what you need." Knox met her gaze, disturbed by how easily she seemed to see through the walls he'd built around himself. "Some men aren't meant for company, Miss Porter." "Faith," she corrected gently. "After saving my life, I think you've earned the right to use my given name." A ghost of a smile touched Knox's lips before he could suppress it. "Faith, then." The storm continued through the night and into the following day, forcing them to remain in the close confines of the cave. Knox found himself increasingly aware of Faith's presence, the scent of her hair when she passed close to him, the musical quality of her rare laughter, the graceful movement of her hands as she helped prepare their meals. It unsettled him, this growing awareness. He'd spent years cultivating his isolation, convincing himself that he preferred the uncomplicated company of mountains and forests to that of people. Yet here was this woman, disrupting his carefully constructed solitude with her quiet strength and unassuming kindness. By the third morning, the snowfall had finally begun to slacken, though the world outside remained blanketed in white. Knox ventured out briefly to gather more firewood and check on his horse, which he'd secured in a sheltered hollow nearby. When he returned, his beard and coat crusted with snow, he found Faith organizing their remaining supplies with efficient precision. "The storm's breaking," he announced, shaking the snow from his clothing. "If it continues to clear, we can leave for Piney Creek tomorrow morning." Faith nodded, though Knox thought he detected a flicker of something regret, perhaps, cross her features. "How difficult will the journey be?" "Challenging with the fresh snow, but my horse can handle it and I know the terrain." Knox hesitated, then added, "We'll need to ride double." "It'll slow us down, but it's safer than trying to walk through snow this deep." "I grew up riding," Faith assured him. "I won't slow you down more than necessary." Knox believed her. In the days they'd spent together, he'd come to respect her resilience and pragmatism. Faith Porter was not a woman who made empty boasts or shied away from hardship. "We'll leave at first light," he decided. "Get as much distance covered as possible before nightfall." That evening, as they sat beside the fire sharing the last of Knox's coffee, a comfortable silence settled between them. Knox found himself studying Faith's profile in the firelight, the delicate curve of her jaw, the slight upturn of her nose, the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks. She'd recovered her color, the dangerous pallor replaced by a healthy glow that heightened her natural beauty. "What will you do when you reach Oregon?" Knox heard himself ask, surprising them both with the question. Faith considered before answering. "I'm not certain I'll go to Oregon now." "Without father?" She trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. "I have some savings. Perhaps I'll seek a teaching position in one of the frontier towns." "Teaching's valuable out here," Knox agreed. "Not many educated women willing to brave the territories." "And what about you?" Faith turned those perceptive eyes on him. "Will you continue your solitary existence indefinitely, never settling in one place?" The question struck closer to home than Knox cared to admit. Before meeting Faith, he would have answered without hesitation yes. This was the life he'd chosen, the one that suited him. But now, faced with the prospect of returning to his solitude after experiencing these days of unexpected companionship, he found himself less certain. "I haven't given it much thought," he answered honestly. Faith's gaze remained steady. "Perhaps you should." The morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having finally exhausted itself during the night. Knox rose early, preparing his horse and packing their meager belongings while Faith folded the bedding and banked the fire. "Ready?" he asked when all was prepared. Faith nodded, pulling on the heavy coat he'd insisted she keep. It was far too large for her slender frame, but it would protect her from the bitter cold better than her city garments. Knox mounted first, then extended his hand to help Faith up behind him. She settled against his back, her arms tentatively circling his waist for stability. The innocent contact sent an unexpected jolt through Knox's body, a sensation both foreign and vaguely remembered, like a language once known but long forgotten. They set off through the pristine landscape, the fresh snow glistening under the clear blue sky. The going was slow, as Knox had predicted, their progress hampered by snowdrifts that sometimes reached the horse's chest. But Knox knew these mountains intimately, finding paths where the snow had been swept thinner by the wind, navigating around the deepest drifts with practiced ease. They rode in companionable silence for the most part, though occasionally Faith would ask questions about landmarks they passed or comment on the breathtaking beauty of the winter landscape. Knox found himself responding more freely than was his habit, pointing out interesting features and sharing bits of knowledge about the terrain that he'd gathered over his years in the wilderness. By midday, they had made reasonable progress, though not as much as Knox had hoped. The temperature was dropping again as clouds gathered on the northern horizon, suggesting another storm might be brewing. "We need to find shelter before nightfall," Knox announced, surveying the threatening sky. "There's an old trapper's cabin a few miles ahead. Not much, but it has walls and a roof." "Will we reach Piney Creek tomorrow?" Faith asked, her breath warm against his neck, doubtful. "At this pace, it'll take at least 2 more days." Knox felt her nod in acceptance, her cheek briefly touching his shoulder. They pushed on, the wind gradually strengthening as the afternoon waned. Knox could feel Faith shivering against him despite the heavy coat, and he urged the horse to greater speed wherever the terrain allowed. The cabin, when they finally reached it as dusk was falling, was little more than a crude shelter, a single room with a dirt floor, roughly hewn log walls, and a stone fireplace. But after a day exposed to the elements, it seemed a palace. "It's not much," Knox apologized as he helped Faith dismount, her limbs stiff from the cold and the long ride. "It's perfect," she assured him, her smile genuine despite her obvious fatigue. Knox settled the horse in a lean-to attached to the cabin's western wall, then set about gathering firewood while Faith cleared away debris from the fireplace. By the time darkness had fully descended, they had a small fire going, casting warm light throughout the humble space. As they shared a simple meal of the last of their provisions, Knox found himself increasingly aware of the intimacy of their situation. The cabin was far smaller than the cave had been, forcing them into closer proximity. When Faith moved to add wood to the fire, her shoulder brushed against his, the brief contact sending that same inexplicable jolt through his body. "Thank you, Knox," she said suddenly, her voice soft in the firelit dimness. He glanced up, questioning. "For what?" "For saving my life." "For sharing your fire with me." Faith met his gaze directly. "I know you value your solitude. Having me thrust upon you couldn't have been welcome." Knox considered her words, surprised to realize they no longer rang true. "It's been less of a burden than I might have expected," he admitted. A smile touched her lips. "High praise indeed coming from you." Despite himself, Knox felt an answering smile tug at the corners of his mouth. "I'm not known for my flowery compliments." "No," she agreed, her eyes sparkling with gentle amusement. "You're a man of few words but meaningful ones." Something shifted in the air between them, a subtle change in the current that had been building since that first night by the fire. Knox felt it in the quickening of his pulse, saw it reflected in the softening of Faith's expression. "Knox," she said quietly, "may I ask you something personal?" He tensed involuntarily, his instinct to withdraw to guard himself against intrusion. But Faith had already breached many of his defenses without even trying. "You can ask," he replied cautiously. "I might not answer," she nodded, accepting his terms. "Before the war, were you alone then too?" The question caught him off guard. Most people who learned of his military service asked about battles, about the horrors he'd witnessed. No one had ever thought to ask about the man he'd been before. "No," Knox finally answered, his voice rough with disuse. "I had family. A small farm in western Pennsylvania. Parents, 2 younger brothers." Faith waited, not pressing, allowing him the space to continue if he chose. "My brothers joined up with me in '61, Knox went on, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Henry was 19, James just 17. I was the eldest at 23. We all went together thinking we'd be home by Christmas." A bitter smile twisted his lips. "Young and stupid like most." "What happened to them?" Faith asked gently. "James died at Antietam, cannon fire, there wasn't." Knox swallowed hard, the memory still raw despite the years. There wasn't enough left to send home. Henry lasted until the Wilderness Campaign in '64, infection from a minor wound, slow and painful. Faith's hand found his in the firelight, her fingers warm and reassuring. "I'm sorry." "My parents got the telegrams. Father's heart gave out a month after Henry's death. Mother followed 6 months later." Knox stared into the flames, recounting the losses with a detachment that had taken years to cultivate. "There was nothing to go home to after the war, so I didn't." "And you've been wandering ever since," Faith said softly, understanding in her voice. Knox nodded. "Seemed easier than trying to build something new." "Is it?" she questioned. "Easier." Knox turned to look at her, really look at her, taking in the compassion in her eyes, the strength in her delicate features. "I used to think so." Faith held his gaze, her hand still resting on his. "And now?" "Now I'm not sure of anything," Knox admitted, the words barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Something changed in Faith's expression, a softening, a decision made. Slowly, giving him every chance to pull away, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question rather than a demand. Knox remained frozen for a heartbeat, his mind struggling to process the sensation of another person's touch after so many years of isolation. Then, as if a dam had broken within him, he responded, his hand coming up to cradle her cheek as he returned the kiss with unexpected tenderness. When they finally separated, both were breathing unevenly. Faith's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright with emotion. Knox felt as though the ground had shifted beneath him, altering the landscape of his carefully constructed existence. "I shouldn't have done that," Faith whispered, though she made no move to increase the distance between them. "No," Knox agreed, his voice rough, "but I'm glad you did." A smile bloomed across her face, radiant in the firelight. "So am I." They stayed awake long into the night, talking as the fire burned low. Knox found himself sharing stories he hadn't allowed himself to remember in years, tales of his childhood on the Pennsylvania farm, of his brother's antics, of the simple life he'd once taken for granted. Faith spoke of her own past her mother's early death, her father's determination to provide her with an education despite limited means, her brief engagement to a banker's son who had proven false. "Is that why you agreed to go west with your father?" Knox asked. "To escape the memories?" Faith considered the question. "Partly, but also because I wanted adventure, I think, a chance to build something of my own, not just accept the life that was expected of me." "And now?" Knox couldn't help but ask. "What do you want now?" Faith's gaze was steady, unflinching. "Something I didn't know I was looking for until a few days ago." The confession hung in the air between them, fraught with possibility. Knox felt himself standing on a precipice, the familiar territory of his solitude behind him, an unknown landscape ahead. The prospect both terrified and exhilarated him. Faith, he began, uncertain of what he meant to say, only knowing he needed to speak the truth as he felt it. I'm not. I don't know if I can be what you deserve. I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are, she replied simply. The man who saved me, the man who shared his fire. The simplicity of her statement struck him deeply. For years, Knox had defined himself by what he had lost, by the empty spaces in his life. Faith saw him differently, not as a collection of absences, but as a presence, a source of warmth in the cold. Before he could respond, Faith yawned, the exhaustion of the day's journey finally catching up with her. Knox smiled, a genuine expression that felt foreign on his face. Sleep, he urged gently. We have a long ride ahead tomorrow. Faith nodded, arranging her bedroll near the fire. Knox positioned his own on the opposite side of the hearth, maintaining a respectful distance despite the intimacy they had shared. Some boundaries, he felt, should still be observed. As Faith drifted toward sleep, her voice came softly through the dimness. Knox, I'm glad I found you in that storm. So am I, he replied, surprising himself with how deeply he meant it. Morning arrived with another bout of snowfall, lighter than the previous storm, but steady enough to concern Knox. They set out despite the weather, Knox's knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable as they navigated the increasingly challenging landscape. Faith sat close behind him, her arms wrapped securely around his waist, her body a warm presence against his back. They spoke little during the ride, conserving energy and focusing on the difficult journey, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. By late afternoon, the snow had intensified again, reducing visibility to mere yards. Knox knew they would need to find shelter soon or risk becoming dangerously lost, even with his intimate knowledge of the area. There's a lined shack belonging to the Sweetwater Ranch ahead, he called over his shoulder, his voice nearly lost in the wind. If I'm right about where we are, we should reach it before dark. Faith nodded against his back, too cold for further conversation. Knox could feel her shivering despite the heavy coat and his own body heat, and he urged the tired horse to greater effort. The lined shack materialized out of the swirling snow just as dusk was beginning to deepen the gray afternoon into night. It was a simple structure, even more basic than the trapper's cabin, but it offered 4 walls and a roof salvation in the face of the strengthening storm. Knox dismounted quickly, helping Faith down before leading the horse to a small attached shelter that was little more than a roof supported by poles. Inside the shack, he found the expected cache of supplies left for ranch hands caught in bad weather matches, firewood, basic provisions, even a few worn blankets. While Faith huddled near the fireplace, Knox quickly built a fire, the flames catching readily on the dry kindling. As warmth gradually spread through the tiny space, Faith shed her outer layers, moving closer to the hearth. Will we reach Piney Creek tomorrow? She asked, her teeth finally stopped chattering enough to form words. Knox shook his head grimly. Not in this weather. The storm's getting worse, not better. We might be here for a couple of days. Faith accepted this news with remarkable composure. At least we have shelter. And supplies, Knox added, inventorying the shack's modest stores. Nothing fancy, but we won't go hungry. As he prepared a simple meal of beans and salt pork from the emergency provisions, Knox was acutely aware of Faith watching him, her gaze thoughtful in the firelight. He'd expected to feel uncomfortable under such scrutiny he'd spent years avoiding the regard of others, after all, but instead found himself oddly pleased by her attention. What? He finally asked. When the silence stretched too long, Faith smiled, shaking her head slightly. I was just thinking how different you are from what I first imagined. Knox raised an eyebrow, passing her a tin plate of food. And what did you imagine? When you found me in the snow, I thought you were some sort of mountain hermit, wild and dangerous, barely civilized. Faith's expression grew serious. But you're not running from civilization, are you? You're running from loss. The observation hit too close to home, piercing the armor Knox had spent years constructing. He looked away, uncomfortable with how easily she seemed to read him. We're all running from something, he deflected. Yes, Faith agreed softly, But at some point we have to stop running and face what's behind us, or we'll never move forward. Knox met her gaze, struck by the wisdom in her words. And what are you running from, Faith Porter? She considered the question, her green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Fear, I think. Fear of living a life without meaning or purpose. Fear of becoming invisible, just another woman who exists to serve others but never herself. Is that why you became a teacher? Faith nodded. It gave me independence, a way to contribute something valuable to the world. A small smile touched her lips. My father understood that. He never pushed me to marry, never treated my education as merely a way to attract a husband. He believed women were capable of as much as men, given the chance. He sounds like a good man, Knox said sincerely. He was. Grief flickered briefly across Faith's features. I miss him terribly. Without thinking, Knox reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. The gesture was instinctive, a desire to comfort that bypassed his usual reserve. Faith's fingers curled around his, accepting the silent support. They remained that way as they ate, hands linked, the connection between them strengthening with each passing moment. When they had finished their meal and set aside their plates, neither seemed inclined to break the contact. Knox, Faith said quietly, what happens when we reach Piney Creek? The question held weight beyond its simple words. It was really asking about them, about this fragile, unexpected thing growing between them. Knox had been avoiding thinking about it, focusing instead on the immediate challenges of their journey. That depends, he answered carefully. On what? Knox met her gaze directly, on what you want to happen. Faith held his gaze, her expression open and vulnerable. I want. She began, then faltered, gathering her courage. I don't want to say goodbye to you in Piney Creek. I don't want that to be the end of our story. Her words stirred something deep within Knox, something he'd thought long buried beneath years of isolation and carefully cultivated indifference. Hope, perhaps, or possibility? I'm not good at this, he admitted, gesturing vaguely between them, being with people, letting anyone close. I've noticed, Faith replied with a gentle smile that took any sting from her words. But you've already done it, Knox. You let me in, you shared your fire. That was different, he protested weakly. You were freezing to death. Faith laughed softly. Yes, and you could have pointed me toward the settlement and gone on your way, but you didn't. You saved me, cared for me. Those aren't the actions of a man incapable of connection. Knox wanted to argue, to defend the walls he'd built around himself, but found he couldn't. Not when Faith was looking at him like that, as if she saw something in him worth salvaging, worth knowing. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Porter? He asked, his tone lighter than he'd intended. Faith's smile widened. I'm not entirely sure. I just know I'm not ready to part ways with you yet. Knox considered her words, considered the woman before him brave, intelligent, resilient. In just a few days, she had disrupted his carefully ordered existence, challenging his assumptions about the life he'd chosen. And strangely, he found he didn't mind. Piney Creek has need of a teacher, he said slowly, the idea forming as he spoke. Last I heard, the children were being taught by the blacksmith's wife, who has no formal training. Faith's eyes brightened. Are you suggesting I stay there? Maybe. For a while. Knox hesitated, then added, and I know the mountains around Piney Creek better than most. They might have need of a guide, a hunter to supply the town with meat. A man who knows the wilderness, Faith said softly, understanding his meaning. A man who might visit the schoolhouse from time to time when he comes to town. He might, Knox agreed, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel, if he was welcome. He would be, Faith assured him, squeezing his hand, very welcome indeed. The weight of possibility hung in the air between them, almost tangible in the firelit intimacy of the lined shack. Knox found himself both terrified and exhilarated by the prospect of changing the solitary path he'd walked for so many years. Faith seemed to sense his inner conflict. She released his hand and moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. We don't have to decide everything tonight, she said gently. Let's reach Piney Creek first, see what awaits us there. Knox nodded, grateful for her understanding. One day at a time. One day at a time, she echoed, leaning her head against his shoulder. They sat in comfortable silence as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, two souls finding unexpected connection in the vast wilderness. Knox slipped his arm around Faith's shoulders, drawing her closer against the chill that crept in despite the fire's warmth. In that moment, something shifted within him, a recognition that perhaps his years of solitude had been less about peace and more about hiding. Faith Porter had found him anyway, not just physically in that snowstorm, but in the deeper sense, reaching past his defenses to the man he'd been before loss had carved him hollow. The storm raged through the night and into the following day, forcing Knox and Faith to remain in the lined shack. They passed the time in conversation, learning more about each other with each hour that passed. Knox found himself sharing stories he hadn't told another living soul, while Faith spoke of her hopes for the future, dreams that increasingly seemed to include him. By the second morning, the storm had finally broken, revealing a landscape transformed by fresh snow that glittered blindingly under the clear blue sky. Knox stepped outside to check on the horse and assess their situation, returning with cautious optimism. "The weather's holding and I recognize where we are now," he announced. "Piney Creek is about 6 hours' ride from here, assuming we don't hit any major obstacles." Faith nodded, already packing their few belongings. "Then we should get started." They set out as the sun climbed above the eastern horizon, Knox once again leading the way with Faith seated behind him. The going was easier than previous days, the worst of the storms having passed, though the deep snow still slowed their progress considerably. As they rode, Knox found his thoughts increasingly turning to the future, a concept he'd deliberately avoided for years. Now, with Faith's arms around his waist and her cheek occasionally resting against his back, he allowed himself to imagine possibilities beyond mere survival. Piney Creek came into view late in the afternoon, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a sheltered valley. Smoke rose from chimneys, and even from a distance, they could see people moving about the main street, the community continuing its daily life despite the recent storms. Knox felt Faith tense slightly behind him. "Nervous?" he asked over his shoulder. "A little," she admitted. "It's been a strange journey." Knox understood her apprehension. In the isolated intimacy of their shared shelters, they had formed a connection that now faced the reality of civilization. Would what they'd found together withstand the pressures and complications of community life? As they approached the town limits, Knox made a decision. Pulling the horse to a stop, he turned in the saddle to face Faith. "Before we ride in there, I want you to know something." Faith met his gaze, her expression questioning. "Whatever happens in Piney Creek, whether you stay or move on, whether you find your place there or somewhere else, I don't want to go back to what I was before I found you in that storm." Knox's words came with difficulty, but he forced himself to continue. "I've been hiding from life for too long." Faith's eyes softened, her hand coming up to touch his bearded cheek. "Are you saying you want to try us, I mean?" Knox nodded, the gesture more vulnerable than anything he'd done in years. "I'm saying I want the chance to know what might be possible between us, if you're willing." The smile that bloomed across Faith's face was answer enough, but her words confirmed it. "I'm more than willing, Knox Sullivan." "I'm eager for it." Their arrival in Piney Creek caused a minor sensation, as newcomers often did in small frontier communities. They were quickly surrounded by curious townspeople, questions flying from all directions. Knox, unaccustomed to such attention, found himself retreating behind his usual taciturn demeanor. But Faith stepped smoothly into the gap, explaining their situation with grace and clarity. The town's de facto leader, a silver-haired man named Samuel Blackford who ran the general store, took immediate interest in their story, particularly when Faith mentioned her qualifications as a teacher. "Lord above, if that ain't Providence," he declared enthusiastically. "We've been prayin' for a proper teacher since Mrs. Miller had her twins last spring. She's been doing her best with the young uns, but she's overwhelmed with her own brood now." Faith glanced at Knox, hope kindling in her eyes. "If the position is truly open, Mr. Blackford, I would be very interested." "Open? Miss Porter, we'd build you a new schoolhouse with our bare hands if that's what it took to keep you here." Samuel assured her. "The one we have is modest but sound. Pay ain't much, mind you, but includes board at the widow Thompson's house. She's got a spare room and could use the company." As arrangements were quickly made for Faith's accommodations, Knox found himself drawn into conversation with several of the town's hunters and trappers, who were impressed by his knowledge of the surrounding territory. Before the evening was through, he had received offers of work guiding hunting parties and supplying the town with game during the harsh winter months. That night, as they sat in the town's small dining establishment, a far cry from the crude shelters they'd shared. But lacking the intimacy they'd come to value, Knox and Faith found a moment of relative privacy to discuss their sudden change in circumstances. "It seems we've both found a place here," Faith observed, her eyes bright with excitement despite her evident fatigue. "At least temporarily." Knox nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by the day's events. "The men say there's an abandoned trapper's cabin about 2 miles outside town. Needs work, but it could be made livable." "Your own place," Faith said, understanding his need for some separation from the bustle of even this small community. "Close enough to visit regularly, but with the solitude you're accustomed to." "Close enough to visit the schoolhouse," Knox added meaningfully. "If the teacher wouldn't mind company now and then." Faith's smile was radiant. The teacher would welcome it, often. The weeks that followed their arrival in Piney Creek established a rhythm to their lives, separate but increasingly intertwined. Faith threw herself into her teaching duties, quickly winning the respect and affection of both her students and their parents. Knox divided his time between hunting, guiding occasional visitors through the mountains, and renovating the trapper's cabin he'd claimed as his own. What began as occasional visits, Knox bringing fresh game to the widow Thompson's house, where Faith boarded. Faith walking out to his cabin on pleasant Sunday afternoons gradually increased in frequency and duration. The townspeople observed the developing relationship with knowing smiles but respectful distance, recognizing that the quiet hunter and their new teacher were finding their way toward each other at their own pace. Winter deepened, then began its slow retreat as February gave way to March. Knox's cabin, once a Spartan shelter, had been transformed through his careful labor into a comfortable home. He'd added a second room, improved the fireplace, crafted simple but sturdy furniture with his own hands. On a crisp March evening, as he added finishing touches to a bookshelf built specifically to hold Faith's cherished collection of volumes, Knox heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Stepping outside, he saw Faith riding toward the cabin, her face alight with excitement despite the chill in the air. "Knox," she called as she drew near. "I've had a letter," he helped her dismount, noting the paper clutched in her gloved hand. "From your uncle in Oregon," Faith nodded eagerly. "Yes, I wrote to him months ago, but with the winter and the unreliable post." She paused, catching her breath. "He's alive, Knox, and he wants me to join him still." Knox felt a cold weight settle in his stomach, heavier than any blizzard snow. He'd known this possibility existed, that Faith's original destination might still call to her. They'd spoken of it occasionally, but as winter had held the passes closed and communication with the outside world limited, it had seemed a distant concern. "That's good news," he managed, forcing the words past the tightness in his throat. "When will you go?" Faith studied his face, then laughed, a bright, clear sound that confused him. "Oh, Knox, I'm not going to Oregon." "You're not?" Relief flooded through him, almost dizzying in its intensity. "No." Faith stepped closer, her green eyes holding his. "I wrote to inform my uncle of my father's passing and to tell him I'd found a position as a teacher and to let him know about you." "Me?" Knox was genuinely surprised. "What did you tell him?" Faith's smile softened. "I told him about the man who saved my life in a snowstorm, who shared his fire when he preferred solitude, who helped me find a home and purpose when I was lost." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his now trimmed beard. "I told him I'd found something I wasn't looking for, but now can't imagine living without." Knox covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. "And what did your uncle say to that?" he said. Life gives us unexpected gifts, and only a fool would refuse them. Faith's eyes shimmered with emotion. He said my father would be happy to know I'd found my own path and someone to walk it with. The significance of her words, the choice she was making, was not lost on Knox. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if to reassure himself that she was real, that this unexpected happiness was not just another dream he'd wake from to find himself alone. "Are you certain?" he asked against her hair. "Oregon was your plan for so long." Faith leaned back to look up at him, her expression resolute. "Oregon was my father's dream for us. Piney Creek is where I found my own dream." Her gaze held his, unwavering. "Where I found you." Knox had never been a man of many words, had never possessed the gift of eloquent speech. But in that moment, he found the words he needed, simple, direct, and true. "I love you, Faith Porter," he said, the declaration feeling like coming home after a long journey. "I never thought I'd say those words to anyone again." "I love you too, Knox Sullivan," she replied without hesitation. "Enough to build a life here with you." As spring arrived in earnest, bringing new growth to the mountains Knox had once roamed alone, the town of Piney Creek witnessed a modest wedding. The schoolteacher and the hunter exchanged vows in the small church, surrounded by townspeople who had come to consider them their own. Faith moved into the cabin Knox had prepared with such care, bringing with her books and laughter and a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. She continued teaching, riding into town each day while Knox pursued his hunting and guiding, their evenings spent together in a contentment neither had thought possible. Years passed, the rhythms of their life together deepening and strengthening with each season. The cabin expanded as their family grew, first with the birth of their daughter, Emma, who inherited her mother's green eyes and quick mind, then with their son, James, named for the brother Knox had lost so long ago. On cold winter nights, when snow blanketed the landscape and wind howled through the pines, Knox would build a fire in the hearth of the home they'd created together. Faith would gather their children close, reading stories or teaching them songs, while Knox watched, still sometimes amazed by the fullness of a life he'd once thought forever beyond his reach. And on the anniversary of the day they'd met, that fateful night when a lone cowboy had seen a woman shivering in the snow and made the choice to share his fire, Knox and Faith would sit together after the children were asleep, remembering how close they'd come to never finding each other at all. "What do you think would have happened if you hadn't heard me that night?" Faith asked once, her head resting on his shoulder as they watched the flames dance. Knox considered the question, his arm tightening around her. "I don't like to think about it," he admitted. "But I believe some things are meant to be, despite all odds." "The reluctant hero," Faith teased gently, looking up at him with the same love that had transformed his world all those years ago. "Who would have thought you were such a romantic at heart?" Knox smiled, no longer surprised by his capacity for happiness. "Only you," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Only ever you." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the wilderness in pristine white. But inside the cabin that had once sheltered two strangers thrown together by circumstance, warmth and love prevailed, a fire shared, a life built together. A journey neither had planned but both had chosen, step by step, day by day, season by season. For Knox Sullivan, who had once believed himself destined for solitude, and Faith Porter, who had been searching for purpose, their unexpected meeting in a Montana blizzard had become the beginning of a story neither would trade for all the gold in the West, the story of how a man who never shared his fire found, in the act of saving another, his own salvation.